Okay, it seems like everyone's found their way here. I apologize to everyone for the link being screwy. I'm not sure what exactly happened. The link was to one of those Family Feud game events from yesterday. But we're here now, we can get started. Those of you who haven't met me yet, which I imagine is not very many, I'm Paul Jones. I'm going to let Nathan and Kyle introduce themselves here in a minute. But before we get started, just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. For those of you who have never been in a Zoom webinar before, you may have noticed it works a little bit differently from a Zoom meeting. The UI is a bit different. You've probably noticed that you are muted and you're like forced muted right now. Basically the way it works, if you have a question or something you want to say, you've got two options available to you. You can raise your hand. There's a button along the bottom that allows you to raise your hand. And then what I'll be doing during the presentation, I'll be watching to see if anyone has their hand up. And then whenever there's a good like pausing point, I'll let Nathan Kyle know that there's a question and I can unmute you or give you the ability to unmute yourself. Or if you'd prefer, there is also a Q&A button along the bottom. You can go there to enter in a question. You just like type out your question. That'll get put into a list of questions. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll just, I'll go through and read those questions off and then Kyle and Nathan can answer. This also gives everyone else the ability to see your question. They can upvote it and they can also add in additional comments and stuff to it. But other than that, I think we're good to go. So yeah, Nathan, Kyle, take it away.
Yeah, I'm Kyle Peltier, and
I'm Nathan Halquist.
Yeah, so we're going to run through some latest and greatest prop scheme features that you can expect in 11.5, and you can prepare for in your extensions. Yeah, we're just going to jump right in and get going. So we got a lot of stuff to talk about. So we're going to run through real quick of what those items are. We're first going to talk about the more properties tool, which you may have seen already in 11.0. This is a simplified scheme kind of tool, which has some ability for propagation. But this is going to be the basis for a lot of these other tools that we're going to cover. So that's why we're going to touch on that first. Nathan's going to go over the scheme painter, which is a new tool, which is a very versatile tool for pulling and pushing a large set of properties from multiple snappers, multiple selections. Advanced selection is, again, another tool that you've probably seen in 11.0. There have been some updates and ways you can customize that tool. So we're going to cover some of those. Scheme apply. We're going to touch on just kind of like what the default behavior is for scheme apply and a way that you could customize that behavior. We'll also showcase the pick tool as a new item in 11.5. And we just have a couple other items at the end for people who are new to prop schemes or haven't already added these things to their extensions. You'll want to consider adding those. A quick side note is we won't be covering anything for data catalog related prop scheme in this session. So this is just going to be just the latest and greatest items to prop scheme base class. All right, so let's jump into the first one. The more properties, we threw it in all quotes because we're talking about this specific quick property button here. Again, you may have seen this already. It did show up in 11.0, and you can see examples of that in Architectural Walls and Fika Office. But essentially what it is it, by default, it'll bring up this window here that you see, and you can change, it brings up scheme-related options of the object that you select in space. So it looks somewhat like a scheme, but it's simplified to just that specific object. And modifying those properties will change that object in real time. So unlike a scheme is you select options and you push them in a second stage. This will change those options in real time. So how can you add this to your extension? It's actually quite easy. A lot of it is handled for you. All you have to do is call init from prop scheme on your prop object, and it will handle all of this stuff in the background. So we can see here on the second method here, this is what happens in the background. Behind the scenes, a prop def tracker is created before the scheme is applied to your object. And then those changes are picked up by that tracker, and all those relevant keys are stored and created. At the end is a prop scheme quick property vessel. That's the magic piece right here, is that vessel. That is the tool that we need for, or that key item that we need for the rest of these other tools that we're going to showcase. That vessel, that information is streamed with the snapper, so it is persistent. You won't have to worry about that getting lost in between drawings or whatnot. And I think I may have mentioned that quick property button that shows up. So you select your object, quick properties show up. The more properties button is optional. It is not there by default. So if you want it to show up, you can override the allow prop scheme quick property method in your object and return true, and then it'll show up there. There are some opportunities for you to customize this behavior if you need to. You can modify the list of properties that show up in that window. By default, again, it's going to pick up the ones from the scheme or scheme related. You can add or remove keys from there manually by overriding the scheme props method and modifying those keys if you wish, or that set of keys. If you already have this set up, you will want to support older drawings when we come out with 11.5. Calling ensure prop scheme quick property vessel in your loaded one will make sure that that quick property vessel exists. If it doesn't exist, it'll create it. If it already exists, it'll leave it alone. I think at a previous time we did this chat, somebody asked if that needs to be in a version check. It does not need to be, but you can. And another item to note is if you're bypassing course functionality for the scheme apply, for how it pushes the props to that object, that tracker won't automatically pick up your keys. So in order to make sure that this tool works and you have that vessel created with the proper keys, you can either manually add those keys by overriding the scheme props and add all those keys in manually, or you can create your own tracker that will pick up those relevant keys on the scheme apply and then create that scheme quick property vessel. Just the last quick tidbit on the more properties tool. We didn't cover the propagate, how that works. I said, as before, by default, you pull up that window and it will changing those options will change that object in real time. But you can propagate as well, which will transition this tool into a more scheme-like window and functionality. So then modifying those options are not in real time, but then you can apply them to a selection of objects. You can see on the right there, the selection criteria, selection query, that stuff is all part of the advanced selection tool, which we're going to cover more later. All right, so I'll jump to a quick demo. This is going to be ultra fast of the more properties tool. So here we have a drawing with some architectural walls items. You can see they have more properties that are listed, some FICA items. Again, these will pull up, it'll show all the options that you have there. In the current example that we showed, this is what we had. We had the FICA shelf. Let's put this off to the side so you can see just changing that item real time will change it. Then we could propagate it. It allows you to do a different selection. And again, we'll do that more detail later. And it applies just a normal push. And again, this push will only happen to like objects, no matter what your selection is. Right, and then Nathan's actually going to take over now. He's going to show you the next tool we're going to cover.
All right, thanks, Kyle. So the next tool we're going to cover in the slides is called the Scheme Painter. I'm going to go into a lot of details about the specifics of the tool, how it works in the slides, because it is new in 11.5. So, no one has seen it yet, but just a quick demo of how it actually works in CET. So to get to it, I'm going to go into the tools menu and I'm going to grab the scheme painter here. When I pull that up, this is going to be the dialog I see. And again, I'm going to go into all the different things this does, but you can see right away it's sort of prompting make a selection. So I'm just going to kind of move this off to the side and then zoom out here. You see I've sort of specced one area and then have a bunch of similar areas with kind of undecided properties. So I'm just going to go ahead and make this selection of this whole group here. And it's going to populate the window here with basically everything I pulled. You see we have some conflicts here at the top that we are being sort of prompted to resolve, and then it shows all of my other non-conflicting properties here as well. So I'm just going to go through and start resolving some of these. Pick, let's see which shelves specifically I wanna pull from. I'll take the shelves on the front here. And then I will take this work surface I can see as well. And then I'm actually just going to turn off the wall setting. So I'm going to ignore the rest of the conflicts and turn off this wall section here. And then once I've done that, I can pick another group. So let's grab this group in this sort of second story here. Select all those objects, and then I'm going to hit apply to selection. And once that is done, you will see this group at the top has taken on the properties of all of the objects here on this first floor group. So that's the basic idea of the scheme painter, what you'd use it for. We can now switch to the slides to go into a little more detail about how that's going to work. So again, like I said, the scheme painter is under the tools menu. What you're going to want to use the scheme painter for is to pull options from a selection of snappers that are potentially from as many different extensions as you want. They potentially are sourced from several different schemes. You pick them all up at once, and then you can push them to other objects in the drawing or even to full prop schemes. So you can create prop schemes from objects in the drawing using this tool. It relies on the sort of in the background, it relies on that same more properties functionality that Kyle was talking about. Making sure you have that prop scheme quick property vessel present is going to be really important in making sure this tool works for you. So let's talk now about some specifics of the dialogue and what it actually does. Starting looking at these different headers for these groups in the main window of the dialogue. I'm just gonna pop those out and sort of go through what each of those means. So the top section is a resolved conflict. It's called resolved because you can see that I have picked one of those FICA panels to be my option, but basically a conflict is when you have objects that have sort of the same properties with different values, essentially. So for example, two panels with different materials would be a conflict. So you see that top section is a resolved conflict. Right below it in red, we have an unresolved conflict. The red is supposed to sort of stand out and say, hey, you need to do something about this, whether it be picking it or going to the bottom to that ignore all conflicts button, which I'll get to in just a second. And then below that, we have the couple sections that are not conflicting, but we still like to group things together by what scheme they belong to, just because it's more organized that way, so that you see we have a couple FICA scheme things, a couple wall settings things. And then at the bottom, we have a section for not compatible, which are things that don't have prop schemes. So maybe some different catalog symbols, some office accessories or something that you have, you might be selected, but we can't do anything about spreading their properties if they don't have a prop scheme. Right at the bottom here, we have this ignore all conflicts. You saw that I used that in the demo, and that's just going to take any remaining conflict groups that are not resolved and just resolve them without picking anything. You see, going sort of back to the top here, that second FICA panel frame display has a kind of a light blue background on it. That's what it's going to look like when you hover over that with your mouse, and it's going to correspond with the object or objects that are described by that also being highlighted blue in the drawing. So it's easy to get a sense of what you are looking at in the dialogue and what it corresponds to in the drawing. We have again this selection tool here, which I'm going to cover in just a couple slides. We have a next button to be able to go to the apply phase, and then we have these checkboxes at the bottom here to decide what you maybe want to, what if you want to pull properties from snappers within blocks or from frozen snappers or not. So I'm seeing we have a question here, actually, on the scheme painter. So the question is from Rolf, and it says, do you need to classify properties that can be handled by the scheme painter? For example, I assume that dimensions are not reasonable to push while finishes and materials are. So the answer to that is, as it stands right now, the scheme painter is going to grab all properties that are prop scheme properties. We've had this conversation a little bit about whether we might want to do something like this, be able to specify which properties get pushed and which ones don't. At the moment, that is not available. Most schemes don't really have dimensional properties in them, so it's not a big deal, but obviously things like the architectural walls do for their scheme, and I'm sure some extensions use that as well. So at the moment, it's going to push all of the scheme properties from the scheme painter, but that may very well be a future development, is to specify ones that can and cannot be used in the scheme painter. All right, so moving on to the next phase of the dialogue. This is what's going to happen once you've sort of picked your objects and you've started marking properties. that you want or you've started picking things you want to spread or don't spread, you're going to see this. Right at the top here, you're going to see this display that shows you which stage you're on. You should sort of think of this dialog as being like a wizard, or like an installation wizard. So you can see right now we're on, stage 2. You can click on these as well. So you can click on the 1 and 2 to move between the 2 phases rather than using the next and previous button if you'd like. But of course, then we also have this previous button here that's going to let you go back and change your selection if you need to. We have a search functionality, which is just click on it's going to pop up a search bar and just highlight matching terms. We have a push value to schemes button in the bottom, and the kind of the purpose of that is to be able to take all these properties from these different objects that you've specified in the drawing and then create a scheme that contains those same properties that you can then save and potentially even use in another drawing. We have all these toggles here on the right hand side, which is going to let you specifically turn things off that you maybe selected but you don't actually want to spread. So for example, in the walls, you saw that I did that. I selected some walls, but I didn't actually want to spread their properties, which is why I turned off those toggles for the walls. We have the wand tool here. This is the same as in the scheme dialog, just an animation to let you pick candidates to push properties to. And then we have your standard apply to all and apply selection options here as well from these buttons. Finally, down here in the bottom right corner, we have these sort of same checkboxes for frozen and blocks, but instead of what you're pulling properties from, this determines what you are pushing properties to. One final thing to note here is all these little scheme icons on the far left side of the dialog. When you click on those, they're going to pop up a more properties dialog. This is just a good way to further see what exactly you're going to be pushing. And you can also, it works fully as a more properties dialog, so you can do all the other things Kyle was talking about as well. All right, so we're going to move on to the next feature now, which is the advanced selection tool. You've seen this in a couple places now, in the more properties, in the scheme painter. It's also in the prop scheme dialog. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it is. And the cool thing about this one is there's a lot of ways to customize it from an extension. So just going to cover that in the next few slides. So what is the advanced selection tool? It is a tool that allows users to have greater control over their selections than they had previously. Be able to select on, things like categories and tags, even write queries. We're going to get into all that. But this just gives users a lot more powerful way to create selections. So you can see here it can exist as an independent dialog. To access the dialog, you're going to go into the Tools menu and select the Advanced Selection tool. It can also exist as a sub-window within a dialog, as you've seen in a couple other places. I included a little method that like an example method you could add to a dialog to create a selection tool. Basically, you are going to create a selection tool content by calling the function selection tool. Then create a sub-window and tell the selection tool content to build within that sub-window. And that's it. You'll then have the selection tool. So it's nice and easy to add one to your own dialog if you'd like. So let me just go back a second. The dialog you can see has 3 main pieces: the selection criteria, the selection query, and the selection history. We're not going to cover the selection history so much. It's pretty self-explanatory. It just shows what you have selected now and what you had selected recently. But both the selection criteria and the selection query have some customizability. So we're going to get into that right now. So the selection criteria, you see it here. It is a tree view UI that lets users toggle on and off different categories or other things that are associated with snappers in space. And when they do that, that's going to select and unselect those snappers that match those different things. So here you see in this picture, I have the categories and I have then a tree of all the different categories, and I have some things turned on and some things turned off, and that'll determine what actually gets selected in space. Nice thing about this tool, user gets to decide which criteria they kind of care about. So if user finds himself not actually using categories very much, or at least not using them to select things, they can hit that little X next to that categories label and it'll get rid of it temporarily. They can always bring it back from the add criteria dropdown, but then that add criteria dropdown is what they would use to find things that maybe don't show up by default. So the kind of the default factory setting is when you open the advanced selection tool, you'll get categories and part tagging criteria, but we have part number, we have levels, depending on what other extensions you have, you may have other things as well. And one last note on this tool is that it is an easier alternative to the query, which I'm going to get to that in a couple slides, but this should be very approachable even for users that are somewhat beginners in CET. So you see in that add criteria dropdown, we have a FICA office sort of criteria, which should hopefully you should be asking the question, how can I add one of these for the extension that I work on? And that's actually what we're going to get to right now on the next slide. Fortunately, it's not too hard. We're going to go through all the steps you need to be able to do that. All right, so here we have the how to create custom selection criteria. You see on the left here, we have a full kind of skeleton code example of how you would do this. First thing you're going to need to do is create a subclass of selection filter. And I will just quickly go through some of the important methods in this little piece of code I put in here that you're going to want to pay attention to. So you have the filter method, which is going to take in a space selection and remove snappers that don't match your sort of internal criteria. Then a couple methods down, we have a pop-up dialog and append tree items. Those are going to dictate what the UI actually looks like. And if you look closely, you're going to see a couple classes pop up in those methods. One of them is selection filter tree view, and one of them is selection tree view item. I'd highly recommend using both of those classes if you go about making your own selection criteria. And the reason is that you get a lot of the toggling and the other thing sort of works out of the box if you use those two classes. So I'd highly recommend using those in your own customizations. And then at the bottom of the class, we have tree item change. That's going to be called whenever a toggle is flipped on one of those things, and then you're going to re-filter the space and update what's selected from there. I noted here that you may want to add some more methods. I've done a few of these, and so I know some examples of some methods that might be useful are things like an accepts method that takes in a snapper, or a set default state for the tree view. But what I show here is sort of the minimal interface that you need to override in order to get this working. Once you have that class all set up, you can call put global view select filter. You can see I put that in at the very bottom of that code snippet in the init block. You're going to call that put global view select filter, pass in an instance of the class. And once you have done that, then it will be available in that add criteria dropdown. that's at the bottom of the selection criteria, and the user can go in there, find your custom criteria and add it to their selection tool and start using it. Okay, moving on to sort of the section 2 of the selection tool is the selection query, which is new in 11.5. This is what it looks like. First thing I'll note is this one is definitely intended for advanced users. I would not expect people that are brand new to CET to be getting a lot of use out of this. But at the same time, we did try to make it approachable to people that may not be super technical or used to writing queries. That they should still be able to dabble in this and get used to it. So you see here, what you kind of see in the picture is a query that is in the middle of being written. So the query is composed of conditions and then joined by the logical operators and an or. Each condition basically has a one parameter, one operator, and some number of values. So here, that part number not equal to FICA J66V is one condition, with part number being the parameter, not equals being the operator, and that part number you see there is the value in that case. It also supports grouping using parenthesis. So as you build up more complex queries, then you can control the order of operations that way. We have a suggestion list that shows up here. So this is sort of what we hope makes it a little more friendly for users to deal with, is this nice drop down that sort of anticipates what the user is going to potentially want to type. And of course, as they type, it'll narrow to match what they have already typed. A lot of these are going to be pulled, a lot of these parameters you see in this dropdown are going to be pulled from the prop input settings on prop defs of snappers in the drawing. So if you have animation properties and quick properties using the new the core properties functionality of prop defs with prop input settings, then by default, we are going to take those and use those as query parameters. We have a way to import those automatically into our system. If, however, you have prop defs that maybe should be in a quick property but shouldn't be in the query tool, then we have a no query attribute you can add to the prop input setting to make sure that it does not show up in the query. A little more about how this gets used. So you can see there's sort of a couple ways to input into this tool. Obviously, you can type. It is a field, so you can just type out your query. But then we also have this dropdown, which you can interact with in a few different ways. You can click inside of it to take these suggestions. You can scroll through it if it's long enough to need a scroll bar. You can also use the up and down arrow keys to go through the different options and then use enter or tab to pick one. Once you've executed a query, then it'll show up in this recent queries drop down here. If you select a query from the recent queries drop down, it'll repopulate it in the field. And from there, it can be re-edited or just ran again or whatever you want to do. You see we have this build up queries. What that means is if you use this in current selection parameter, then you can actually build queries that work with existing selections in space. So you can say in current selection and something, something, something. If you would like to kind of refine your selection, you can say or if you want to expand upon it, or just don't use it at all if you don't want. And this is another place, this dropdown of parameters where you can add your own custom things. From the extension perspective, you see we have that FICA panel type highlighted in there as a parameter, and you can add these in your extension as well, and they will show up in the query tool. So I'm going to show now how you go about doing that. I didn't actually want the demo quite yet. There we go. So going to go through just this quick code example and then go ahead and go to the demo after that. So this is, again, sort of a skeleton of what you have to do to create a parameter yourself. You see using in several places in here, you see CETQL. This is what the query language is called in code, the CET query language, or I'll often just say it's SQL for short. So you're going to want to create a subclass of this SQL parameter. And then, just going through what these different methods do here. In the constructor, you need to set up domains for valid operators, valid values, and also for what it should filter on. So snappers, singularities, vessels. Practically speaking, most of what you're going to do is only going to work with snappers. There is some support for other things, but typically you're just going to want to deal with snapper filters. Once you've done that, you're going to set up a label and icon. The label is just the name for the parameter in the tool, and the icon is, if you want, is a little picture that can go with it. Same for object to label and object to icon, except that those are going to be for the individual values that the parameter can take on. The icon and object to icon are totally optional. You definitely don't have to return anything there. But if you want to, then we have that support to add little pictures to help identify things more easily for the user. And then finally, at the bottom, we have the internal accepts method, which is going to take in an operator and a value, and then a snapper, vessel, or singularity. But again, in most cases, it's going to be the snapper, and then you just return whether those all match. The reason it's internal accepts rather than accepts is because we have a sort of final accepts that simplifies more complicated operators into some combination of equals and less than. So if you create one of these classes, then you don't need to worry about every possible operator. You can just, as long as you can answer the question for equals and less than if it's numerical, then you're in good shape. Once you've created the class, again, we have a sort of a thing to call in your initializer. This time it's called add universal SQL parameter. And instead of passing in an instance, you're going to pass in a hook that takes in a space and returns an instance. You don't have to use the space when constructing it if you don't want to, but sometimes it's nice to have the space in the parameter, or to be able to, depending on what kind of space it is, say you do or don't want to return that parameter. All right, yeah, so I am actually going to now do a quick demo.
There we go. Got it right this time.
To do a quick demo of the selection tool. So again, you can find it under Tools and then Advanced Selection. Click on that. It's going to open this nice dialog here. You can work with it in this fully expanded mode, or you can minimize it. Do this kind of skinny version that you can kind of stick off to the side and use without really interrupting your drawing at all. But in here, let's just go over the selection criteria. So this is the categories. For example, you can see we have a lot of categories in this drawing, but I can just start picking some of these. Say I want to turn on everything that is electrical. And you can see that just turned on a bunch of things. That you can see as well that everything that's electrical is also tagged as panel, so those all turned on automatically as well. But I can go through here and maybe I want to turn on the plants as well, so I can do that. And there you go. That's how the criteria works. And then if I want different criteria, then I use this add criteria drop down, and I can add levels or part number or FICA office or whatever else happens to be in there. And then quickly the selection query. So gonna pop that up here. You see when I hover on it or click on it, then we get this field with this very long drop down right now. The reason it's so long is because I haven't started typing anything yet, so it's sort of suggesting everything to me. I'm going to go ahead and build a query off of the existing selection. So I'm going to say in current selection or, and then it's going to start giving me some different parameters I might want to use. Let's say I want to use part number in, and then I can pick some different options. So maybe this cabinet and the uh, the rectangle work surface maybe are the two that I want. So, whoops, let's find the rectangle work surface again. There we go. Close that off, and then I'm just going to run that. You see that altered my selection to add some new things there that were not there before, like these rectangle work surfaces. And then that query is going to show up in my recent queries, and I can click on it and repopulate it in the field, and then continue working on it or do whatever I want to do with it. So I think with that, are we going back to the slides, Kyle? I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, I
you
didn't
want.
mean to. Didn't mean to call you out there. No, I was genuinely unsure if I was supposed to
Mess up
be.
one time.
All right.
Yeah, this is what we got next.
Cool. So this is my last couple slides. You want to mute yourself, maybe? Thanks. So it's my last couple slides, and then we're going to hand it back to Kyle to kind of bring us home. But this is the scheme apply. So we included this because we got a lot of questions as we were doing this project for adding new things to schemes. How would I go about picking sub-objects of snappers as candidates to push schemes to? And we realized we didn't really have a good way out of the box to do that, so we came up with this route that you can take in your implementations if this is a functionality you think you might need. But first, I'm just going to go through what the default behavior is. So we have here the prop scheme apply animation creates an apply vessel. It then sends an apply event to that vessel. And then the vessel is going to handle the push. It's going to grab any prop scheme data that are associated with the animation. And then for each one of those, it's going to call that owner event apply, which is just going to push to all of the candidates being snappers, which means you don't really have a say over picking specific sub-objects of snappers to push to in this particular case. But we have sort of an alternative route for people that need this functionality. In order to do that, you are going to use custom vessels. So I'm going to quickly go through what that looks like. I have an example of how you might do that here. So first, in your chosen of the snapper, then the candidate can actually steal the default apply vessel from the animation and replace it with its own custom apply. So you see I've done that there. I have animation transfer vessels by tag, and I'm stealing the apply, and then I'm providing the my custom apply. Make sure if you're doing this in chosen that you're giving the vessel back in abandoned so that the animation can continue working normally for other objects. Once you have your custom vessel, then it can handle apply however it sees fit, or however you see fit, I guess. So in this case, I have, when I get that owner event that's apply, then I call the apply method, and in my apply method, I'm just looking for a sub-candidate that I maybe put on the animation, and then I'm applying the scheme to that sub-candidate. You can also use these vessels to add animation properties to give even more customization to the prop scheme apply animation. Then finally, something that could be useful
is to use this in sort of tandem with a custom push props visitor. The reason you might want to do this would be, for example, if you want to not do the default push behavior whenever you're using this custom apply vessel, then you would create a push props visitor that looks for the candidate being one of these objects that has this custom apply vessel and then just does not push using the default mechanism to those objects. So that's it for me. I'm going to hand it back to Kyle to cover the last couple topics.
Cool, thanks, Nathan. All right, yeah, so I'm going to cover the pick tool, which is a new item in 11.5. It's just another quick, simple tool that's been added. And what we're referring to here by the pick tool is this eyedropper button here. And that's going to start, so this button will be on PropSchemes in 11.5 by default. When that button is selected, it'll start an animation tool, which will essentially allow you to select a snapper in space that's relevant to the current scheme. So the current card or the currently selected card on the scheme. It'll find a snapper that's relevant in space, and you can pick up all the properties from that object and populate your scheme with those options. So note in this slide here, everything is undecided, all the finish options and such like that. And here's just an example of it in use. It would pick this panel frame in this case, pick that up and populate all of the options in the scheme dialog. An interesting item here. So if you're not familiar with the Office framework, in this drawing we're looking at specifically a panel frame. And panel frames themselves are a snapper, but they also have junctions on both ends. Those are different snappers. And you'll notice in this scheme at the very bottom, the last section there is posts and connectors. And those options got pulled in, even when they were selecting a frame. So what's happening here is by default, the pick animation tool will automatically grab snappers from a main that are included in single selection. So by default, that would be your lonely remove snappers. And in this case, in Office, those junctions are included. So that's how the post connectors option was also pulled in. So that's something you want to be aware of. Again, if your scheme like this includes multiple objects, can those items be populated by include single selection? So I want to make note of that. So there's actually a lot of entry points for you to customize how this behavior works, or you can get rid of it altogether. So we're going to cover that first real quick. So if you happen to not want this tool at all, again, by default, it'll show up for your prop schemes in 11.5. You can remove it from the entire scheme by setting the no pick all prop to true. There's an example of that on the right. So the root is, the prop def on the root is getting updated on the prop scheme UI factory. So that will remove it from the entire scheme. Or you can remove it on a per card basis or the individual tabs. And you'd set the same prop to true on those prop scheme cards. So if you, for whatever reason, want to get rid of that, you can do that. So again, there's a lot of ways you can customize it. All the methods on the right are under PropScheme.cm. So you could override all of these, but I'm just showing you the default behavior here. When the eyedropper button is selected, you'll get a call to that animate pick event, which in highlighted, it shows it by default creates the pick properties animation and passes in the pick properties animation args. The pick properties animation args is that method on the bottom. And you'll notice one of those arguments that it's sending in is the include single selection is by default set to true. So that's going back to what we looked at last slide. So you could modify that if you want, but that is where that's coming from, and that's how it's pulling in all of those snappers by default. The keys to pick is worth mentioning. The keys to pick are the keys on the active scheme card. So by default, on the left here, is showing the default behavior. It's going through that card and picking up all of the props on that scheme. So you could modify that, and if you want to, but this will show up in the next slide. It's just hard to keep track of where some of these things go sometimes. But yeah, so keys to pick is assigned to allow pick keys. So next we'll talk about how the pick tool actually grabs candidates from space. The animation, as it's hovering over candidates, grabs the snapper candidate, and it actually sends that over to the scheme data and asks the scheme data if that object is valid for selection. So that's what we're seeing here on the right. The first line of defense is it checks if it's valid for pick. That method really just caches the objects that you're hovering over. The main meat of this tool is in the pickable props. So it grabs an object, which checks to make sure it's a snapper object, and then checks for compatibility. So the first line of defense that it has is it checks to make sure that whatever snapper you're targeting is actually relevant to the scheme that started the animation. So that's just to make sure that it's relevant. Your snapper's related scheme is the one that started the animation. The allow pick keys here is showing up again. Those are the keys from the scheme that it's looking for. And then it checks the snapper in space if it has keys that are relevant. If it does, then it pushes those to snapper props. Oops. And then it would push all those on and apply. So it looks like we're running out of time. So I'm going to fast forward here. I'm going to do a quick demo of the last couple items. This should be pretty fast. So we'll showcase the pick tool here real quick. You have a scheme here. Let's go back to the default. So default is empty. Again, you'll see this eyedropper tool here. Starts up the animation, and you'll notice it only selects relevant snappers in space. You pick one of those up, and it populates all those items. So this is also a really good way for users if they want to create new schemes off of something in the drawing, or maybe modify it slightly. They can pull up those options and just create new schemes off there. The last couple tidbits, I'm going to go pretty fast here, but they're pretty quick items. These things are for people who are new to PropSchemes, or if you haven't added these already to your extensions, we advise you to do so. First is the Schemes Explorer. You can find that in the Tools menu. This is just a way for users to navigate all of the schemes that they have loaded for all extensions. These are grouped. So right now, all we have are just like the CET designer related group with different schemes. So for your extensions, you can create a group and you can create different sections for different schemes that you might have for your different extensions. So we ask that you add your schemes to that if you're using PropSchemes. And then the last thing we'll look at real quick in the slides is this item here. This is an example you can see in Fika Office, actually both adding to the Schemes Explorer and this one. A lot of people had asked if there was a way to do this. There is a core way to quickly add a scheme selector in your library, which allows users to just quickly switch between schemes without having to have that scheme dialog open and switching between them. So again, we'll cover how you can actually do this. The Schemes Explorer is simple. All you have to do is call add default prop scheme in your extension and pass in your scheme, an instance of your scheme. And that will register it to the Schemes Explorer. But you'll want to make sure you override these other methods for making everything look nice and consistent with everything else. You know, putting your schemes in a group and then having their individual name and icon. And then last item, the scheme selector. For this one, all you have to call is append scheme selector within your library, passing in the library lim, who the parent is. There was a change between 11.0 and 11.5 for this particular function call. It used to take as a parameter a library function name. So now in 11.5, it will no longer take that parameter, and you'll have to override that in your prop scheme. And looks like we're right at time. I was just going to note real quick, there are some resources. I'm sure you're all familiar with the migration guide. There is a separate guide specifically for prop schemes that has migration information and new feature information, all the stuff that we covered in this presentation. So you can look there. And again, you'll have all these links when we send out these slides. There's also a lot of stuff on my configure support page for, from a user's perspective, how these tools are expected to work. So if you're changing things or customizing things, you can look here for how those are intended to work and what users will expect from those tools. And I'm not sure what kind of time we have left, but we can take questions. If you guys have any, I don't know, I wasn't watching if there's any in the Q&A right now, Paul.
There's not. Since we're out of time, though, I'm going to do it a bit different. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of wrap it up, but if anyone wants to stick around for questions, that's great. But for those of you who need your break before the next session, refill your beverage or whatnot, we're done with the presentation. So I want to thank everyone here for your attention. We really appreciate it. For the rest of the experience. For those of you who want to stick around for a little bit of Q&A, we'll do that.